In this video, we're going to take a look at the bottom of the human movement system, where movement's actually occurring. So before we move into the body parts, we're going to look at the nervous system, the muscular system, and the articular system, and from a general perspective. And then eventually we're going to look at the individual muscle groups that are operating here. So when we look at this pyramid here, we have this hierarchy of tissue control, which I've talked about in other videos. And what we're really interested in is the movement that's occurring as the output of these systems of the body. The nervous system, muscular system, and articular system are stratified here, but in reality the neuromuscular system exists together. You can't separate that. And so you have all these muscles that are controlled by the nervous system that are generating tension, generating force, and those muscles are exerting their will, their tension, onto the skeletal system here. We have the articular system here, which is a complex system. It's not just the bones of the skeleton, but it's the connective tissue. And most importantly, it's the joints that are where the movement's occurring, where the magic happens for functional movement. So we'll get into the muscular system in the next lecture. We've talked a little bit about muscles themselves, and really knowing the muscles are going to be part of normal vernacular, normal aspect, using the words, terms, and same thing with the skeletal system. We want to know the terms. We want to use the scientific terms, like using humerus versus arm or patella versus kneecap. So we'll start here in the skeleton, and when we start looking at the skeletal aspect, we look at the divisions of the skeleton, and we have the axial skeleton, which you see here on the left, and we have the appendicular skeleton on the right. And the primary difference is the axial, axis, central. You have usually, except for the ribs, one of everything. So you have one spinal column, one sacrum, one skull. You do have pairs of ribs, but they're really extensions of the thoracic vertebra. When you look over here at the appendicular skeleton, that includes the shoulder girdle, the pelvic girdle, and then these appendages, the arms and the legs. And that's really where you have your upper extremity, lower extremity, and then your shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle act as relay stations for force transfers, so your leg and arm are interconnected. And this is where a lot of our analysis goes when we look at movement. We're looking at like a stable central core. We group the spine into itself, even though it's multiple divisions, multiple bone segments, and then we're really looking at the linear output of force that's occurring between your contact with the ground and the acceleration through the trunk and spine. So here again, you look at our primary divisions of the skeleton, and then we have the vertebral column, which we classify as one functional group, so you can look at that as a column itself, although there's a lot of interesting biomechanics happening there. You have your shoulder girdle, you have your pelvic girdle, and then, as I said, these are acting as relay stations between the lower extremity and the upper extremity. And when we start to visualize the body, instead of trying to visualize it as these individual bones, individual components, grossly for our anatomy or our movements, we're looking at this figure, if you will, that has this central core, or the spine, and then these relay stations for the upper and lower extremities of the shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle. So this image here is an easier way to kind of group our movements and to help appreciate, particularly like gait pattern, squatting pattern, sports performance, looking how the left upper extremity is maybe connected biomechanically to the right lower extremity, and use this as a map instead of looking at individual bones. Now we do have multiple segments here, and we have two segments to the upper and lower extremities, and we have a complex network of joints and articulations in the hand, particularly in the feet, and then we have movements up here in the head and neck and jaw. But when we start looking at this, we can start to look at the complexity of the body. But when we start looking at it this way and we start to reduce it down into these individual segments and these individual articulations, right? So we really only have 7 joints. So pairs, of course, right? So 3 on the left arm, 3 on the right arm, 3 in the left leg, 3 in the right leg. And then the spine, but the spine really is 3 or 4 segments, right? Cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. It becomes a lot easier to navigate and really to understand. So when we start looking at joint motion, we really, like I said, have 3 in the upper extremity, so the shoulder, elbow, wrist, and we look at the hand as a complex aspect for very specific components. But if you're able to grasp the item, you're usually pretty good. We look at the hip, knee, ankle, and the foot is a very miraculous structure, the ability to go from a rigid lever to a mobile adapter right away. So we'll look at that complexity. And then, like I said, the spine. So it becomes easier to wrap your head around what you need to understand and how we start to look at movement from this specific aspect. So when we start looking at this, we look at the appendicular skeleton, and this is where we're going to get our primary movements, right? Like extension, flexion, internal external rotation, abduction of the arm moving on the fixed body, and the arm is connected to the shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle, and then you have your axial skeleton, which your cervical divisions, right? Cervical vertebra, thoracic, lumbar, and we'll get into more detail when we get into the spine. But that's really, when you're looking at classification of movements, are these 7 joints looking at all the available movements that we're looking at within the planes of motion. So it really becomes simple when we start looking at that perspective. So in the skeletal system, the primary introduction is the bones, and these are the connective tissue, the firm mineral-based tissue, and it's also a combination of the articular system, which is a name for the joints, which includes the connective tissue, right? And so the articular system here is all the joints, all of the bones. This is where movement is occurring. This is all passive tissue. It's non-excitable tissue. It is 100% dependent upon neuromuscular input. So we're going to start our conversation here and then build up as we move forward in the class. So in your textbook, you have the categories of bone: long, short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid. And this doesn't really play that big of a role in our understanding, but it's just quick to kind of help with the categorization of this. When we look at bones like the sesamoid bones, which really are found in a couple parts of the body, you have the patella, and then you have the sesamoid bones under the first ray of the big toe. And what these are doing is they're actually acting as an anatomical pulley, so they're redirecting force. Your patella is actually pushing your patellar tendon out, so it allows you better efficiency in knee extension. So these are more just redirecting force or changing the moment arm. You have irregular bones, and the primary irregular bone that we're going to be dealing with are the bones of the spine, so the vertebra. Parts of the skull, like the sphenoid here, are irregular, and these are basically bones that have complex shapes. These are bones that are not categorized into long, short, or flat bones. The pelvis sometimes is considered an irregular bone because of the protrusions here, particularly in the ramus and the pubis and so forth. But then when you get up into the ilium, this is considered more of a flat bone, which is another category of bone. So this can go both ways depending upon if you're looking at it as a fused bone or the bones before they fuse. But that brings us to the next area, flat bones. You have your scapula, which is the one you're going to be dealing with the most, the sternum, and the ribs. And so these are really the flat bones, and then of course the remaining bones of the skull. And these are bones that are large flat surfaces that are usually protecting areas of the body, like the rib cage and the skull, or flat surfaces that muscles are spanning out and over. Your second to last are the short bones, and these are bones that are as thick as they are long. These are primarily found in the wrist and the ankle, so your tarsals and your carpals. In your hand, so this is your tarsal here, and you can see it's short and short and stout, and it is right here in the ankle, and again the carpals that you find in the wrist. Your bones of the hand and feet, you have the phalanges here, and these are considered long bones. So it's only the short subset of bones that are short bones, and your long bones are longer than they are wide. These are the bones that you primarily find in the arms and legs, so your femur, tibia, fib, and then your humerus and your radius and ulna. So these are your long bones, and this is where most of the movement's happening. Your clavicle is also considered a long bone, because that's really the movement of the scapula is really interconnected through the scapula to the sternum through that bone itself. So these are your bones of the system, right? Your different shapes, they all have different aspects, and that's all you really need to know about it. So trying to classify the bones, there can be disagreement here and there. Just understand that there's different shapes, and most important, especially for the irregular bones, are the names of the processes or the stuff that muscles attach to. The next part is the articular system when we're looking at the joints, and these are where the bones are coming together. I think the only thing I really want to point out is that when there's a common vernacular for the language for the use in anatomy, and then there's the scientific aspect. And I just want to introduce the naming aspect, and they're usually derived from the bones involved or the parts of the bones that are involved. And so we'll use the example as the elbow. And the elbow is the articulation between the humerus and the ulna. So you have this part of this bone interacting with this bone here. And so the elbow technically is called the humeral ulna joint. So you have the humeral ulnar joint, and it's the articulation between the humerus and the ulnar. Also in this area you have the radial ulnar joint, and so that is the articulation between the radius and the ulna. But unfortunately this is not complete because you have a proximal and a distal radial ulnar joint, just like you have a proximal and distal tibia fibula joint. So you start to get specific with the anatomical terms and with the anatomical structures. Shoulder is another joint that is talked about, and the shoulder is confusing because there's really 4 to 5 joints that make up the shoulder. Typically we think of the glenohumeral joint, so that's the humerus articulating with the glenoid fossa of the scapula, so the glenohumeral joint. But then we have the scapula itself that has a quasi-articulation with the thorax, and so that's the scapulothoracic joint. But the scapula-thoracic joint is not a true joint. It's a movement that we see, but the joint of the scapula connecting to the body is really through the clavicle. And so you have your sternoclavicular joint, so the sternum and the clavicle, and then you have your clavicular articulation with the scapula. This part of the scapula is a acromion process, so you have your acromioclavicular joint. So you can see how these names are derived from either the bone itself, the name of the bone, or the part of the bone or process that the other bone is articulating with. When we look at the hip is a relationship between the femur and the pelvis, but this part of the pelvis is called the acetabulum, and so the hip joint is the femoral acetabular joint. So you can see the naming and just kind of keep track of that, and just be aware that there's a second set of names that are beyond just hip, elbow, knee, shoulder. Now, working with clients, you most likely will be using the common vernacular, but in textbooks and research and study and in academia settings, the formal names, and not to be fancy or schmancy, but for clarification. Again, like the shoulder is a very particular aspect, like what part of the shoulder are you referring? So when we get into the joints themselves, we can classify the joints according to the way the bones are bound to each other. And so this brings us to the structural classification. And you have bony joints and fibrous joints, and I have it set up like a traffic light. There's no movement there. You have cartilaginous joints, which slight movement, and then you have synovial joints, which allow quite a bit of movement. Structure dictates function, meaning that how things are designed and shaped are going to determine how they're functioned. So you have 2 classification systems actually. You have a structural classification and you have a functional classification. And so the functional classification, there's only 3, and you have the synarthrodial, so no movement, amphi or semi-arthrodial, so slight movement, and then diarthrodial, which is full movement. So this first tier of joints here where there's no movement occurs, these are the types of joints here, like these gomphuses. These are the tooth sockets. These are things where you don't want a lot of movement. Sutures of the skull, so these are fusion points of when bones were not connected and now are connected. Same thing with the pelvis. And then the syndesmosis, like these really dense connective tissue that do transfer forces, but kind of holding those bones together. Then you have your cartilaginous joints where there's movement, but there's not movement. So there's slight movement, more of like a shock absorption to allow stress relief. So that's like your pubic symphysis here and your vertebral bodies, and then the articulation between the ribs and the sternum. So you have solid connection, but a little bit of flex and give to allow movement to yield. And then our final joint is a synovial joint, and this is the quintessential joint that you'll be dealing with the most. This is where you have the most amount of movement. These are bones are connected by a joint capsule, and there's separated by a joint cavity, so there's an actual space that exists. So the other bones that we're looking at had a really solid contact surface, a lot of reinforcement, not a lot of movement. Here you have soft connective tissue that are holding the 2 joints together. What makes up the diarthrodial joints or synovial joints is you have an articular capsule, you have a synovial membrane that contains synovial fluid, and then at the end of each bone you have articular cartilage. So you have some kind of lubrication or friction reduction component to allow for compression. Now, when you look at those joints, there's a trade-off between stability and mobility. And so the more stable a joint is, like this is straight up bone fusion, super stable, no movement whatsoever. And then as you start to move into more mobility, you also give up some stability structurally, like passive stability. We'll talk about this when we get to each individual unit or body part. But it's not saying that the glenohumeral joint is unstable, it's just saying that the glenohumeral joint is not relying on passive stability. It's more relying on functional stability. But the more movement you have, the less stability you're going to have, and that's just the trade-off that happens between that. This chart's from your book, and it just kind of superimposes the structural classification with the functional classification, and just to kind of keep track of the names of the joints. So we're not going to deal too much with these joints here. What we're really going to focus our attention on are these joints and the types of joints. Again, we're really not going to get into that so much. It's more important that we understand the degrees of freedom or the mobility that it can occur at the joints. So the 6 types of joints are listed here, right? So you have these different shapes and the way that the structure can affect the function, and you have like your pivot joint, your hinge joint, and each of these joints are found throughout the body. Ball and socket joints allowing the most amount of movement, and your plane joints maybe having the least amount. But what's important with these 6 types of joints are the degrees of freedom that is offered in, or at least available per there. And what the degrees of freedom are really talking about is how many planes of motion does that joint operate in. So you can either have a 1 degree of freedom, which is a uniaxial joint, and the reason why it's referred to as a uniaxial is because it only has 1 axis, and that means it's moving in 1 plane of motion. You can have a 2 degrees of freedom, so that's a biaxial joint. That's a joint that moves in 2 planes or axes. And then you have a multi-axial or triaxial joint, which is the most you can have. A joint moves in 3 planes or axes, and that's 3 degrees of freedom. And these degrees of freedom are referring to the planes of movement that we've already learned. So sagittal plane, frontal plane, transverse plane. Now, it doesn't mean that the 1 degree of freedom is always a sagittal plane and 2 degrees. You can have a joint that has 2 degrees of freedom and it moves only in the sagittal and the transverse plane, like the knee. You can have a joint that has 3 degrees of freedom and it moves in all 3 planes, or 1 degree of freedom. So when we look at the planes of motion, right, we have the 3 cardinal planes coming through, and you have your frontal axis, sagittal axis, and vertical axis, which is the axis of rotation that the movement is rotating about in that particular plane. So when you have 1 degree of freedom, for example, we can just say flexion and extension. If you have 2 degrees of freedom, that can be adduction and abduction, or you can have a 3rd degree here, internal external rotation. Now, it doesn't have to be in that order. It can be any one of those, but if 1 plane of motion exists, it's going to have 1 axis of rotation, 1 degree of freedom, and so forth. So again, you can kind of see this superimposed with the coordinate system that's there. And remember that the flexion extension is about this axis, and that's creating movement in the sagittal plane. This is anterior, posterior, lateral, medial, superior, inferior. You have ab and abduction that's occurring in the frontal plane. So this is the axis of rotation that's occurring here, arm out to the side, side bending. And you have the internal external rotation or medial lateral rotation occurring in the transverse plane. So when we look at this example here of elbow flexion, so here's the arm in extended position, here's the flex position, and we're looking at the elbow or the humeral ulnar joint. This only has, the shape of the joint only allows movement in 1 plane. It's a hinge joint, so it's 1 degree of freedom, and it happens to be in the sagittal plane about the medial lateral axis, creating flexion and extension. If we get movement in the frontal plane, so we get like a varus and valgus position, that's going to start to rupture the joint structure and ligaments, and if we try to rotate, we're also going to rupture and break some bone. So the structure does not allow movement outside of the sagittal plane, so this joint has 1 degree of freedom. We look at something like the knee, where it has an obvious similar type axis of rotation. It looks like a hinge, but it also has a planar component because it does flexion and extension in the sagittal plane, as you see here, but it can also do internal external tibia rotations. That tibia, that foot, can turn in and can turn out, and so it can do internal external rotation, and that's happening in the transverse plane. So this joint, the knee, has 2 degrees of freedom. So we can move up to the hip. The hip is a ball and socket joint, and it has 1 degree in the sagittal plane, has another degree in the transverse plane, and another degree in the frontal plane. So it has 3 degrees of freedom, and so it can move in the transverse, it can move in the sagittal, and it can move in the frontal plane. And we can see that superimposed here. So the hip has 3 degrees of freedom, and this is the femoral acetabular joint that has those 3 degrees. Again, it's kind of a review of the coordinate systems, but it's kind of now adding the degrees of freedom, looking at the shapes of the joint and the available motion there. And again, I wouldn't spend time trying to memorize all the shapes and different shapes. What we're really going to be focusing on is how many degrees of freedom exist there, and knowing which available planes of motion that exist in each of these joints moving forward.